Hi, hello everyone. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Fernando. I'm very excited and pleased to present the key findings of the study. And I think we all understand that this is indeed quite a hot topic at the moment. And why that is, we are going to talk about in just a bit. But let me first bring up some points for discussion. And we actually already had these discussions to some extent in a smaller group during our workshop back in July in Brussels. I'm not sure how many of the participants of today already joined us for the first online meeting, but during that meeting we already looked at the various options for green energy sourcing, how they can be designed and combined. And then we looked at how the options can be differentiated in terms of credibility and price. What we also discussed, especially with the wind and solar associations, are the implications of the clean energy package, also called the winter package. The European Commission came forward with end of 2016. What we added to the slide deck is an overview of which steps industrial consumers can follow in order to implement green energy sourcing. So why I brought these points up, these points of discussion up now at the beginning is because these are not at all sort of definite guidelines or standards, but can be taken into consideration and are really up for discussion. So maybe good to keep this in mind for this webinar. Following this agenda of the webinar, I would like to first introduce the topic a bit and talk about the motivation behind green energy sourcing for industrial consumers. Then we will go over the different options for green energy sourcing and then talk about the quality and price considerations we came up with. The policy market outlook will be rather brief today for two reasons. We simply had to trim the full slide deck a bit, and also my colleague Malte Gebhardt will be hosting a webinar end of October, and he will talk about current trends in corporate renewable sourcing. So for today, we are putting a bit more emphasis on some practical recommendations for industrial consumers. Okay, so just to make sure that you know who's claiming to know something about green energy here today, let me very briefly introduce Ecofys and Navigant. Ecofys was founded some 30 years ago, and we joined Navigant Consulting last year. Our global footprint is now pretty much spread across the globe, and we have over 600 experts in the Navigant energy practice. And what we are really doing is we are connecting the dots within the triangle between policy, the energy sector, and consumers. And here you can see on the right side for who we are actually connecting these dots. And the list, of course, includes the energy-intensive industry. And we have a strong track record of developing and implementing green energy strategies. In the center of the slide, you can see the so-called energy cloud, which is a piece of our thought leadership. And having our experts at Navigant Research involved in most projects, we can always rely on profound market intelligence throughout the energy sector. Okay, so enough of that. Let's talk about green energy sourcing and why this topic is actually popping up on the agendas of more and more corporates. So for one, we have seen ever since the Paris Agreement conference that more and more players are stepping up and coming forward with commitments to switch to renewable energy. And from that perspective, they also do that because it is simply absolutely crucial to achieve for achieving the 2-degree target, which has been agreed on in Paris 2 years ago. Global greenhouse gas emissions will have to decline drastically, and in Europe, about 30% of the emissions are caused by the energy sector. Of course, this is not really new, but the level of commitment noticeably increased since the Paris Agreement. And I don't mean just policy, but the private sector, really. And they very often do that by signing up to one or several of the global initiatives for green energy sourcing. For the Carbon Disclosure Project here on the left, initiated a long time ago already, the public and voluntary disclosure of information on the environmental impacts of corporates, and various stakeholders like customers, shareholders, or NGOs are seeking this information for their considerations. The CDP also provides guidance on how to account for indirect greenhouse gas emissions from energy supply, and they also increasingly pay attention to the various options for corporates to source low-carbon energy. Green energy is in practically all cases one of the main elements of a sustainability or CSR strategy, which of course always aims to reduce, if not eliminate, a company's carbon footprint. Now, the Science-Based Targets Initiative actually enables corporates to lay out a carbon reduction path which is in line with the global 2-degree target, and it really acknowledges the particularities of a company or an industry. So it kind of informs corporates about the climate action the international community and science would expect them to take. And also here, energy sourcing is usually the most effective lever to achieve those targets. Now, the RE100 initiative of the Climate Group focuses only on setting 100% renewable energy targets. And just as the other major or small initiatives, it provides guidance for the companies which sign up, and they also create good visibility and PR for them. At the same time, this sort of puts pressure on the companies who are missing out or not taking action. And this is also why more and more companies are joining these initiatives. And yeah, we can also recommend doing this. So we've talked about how green energy sourcing is basically the right thing to do, and how more and more companies are committing to it and put their competition at a tight spot. But there's actually one most compelling argument to source green energy from renewable sources, and that is the undisputed trend towards their cost effectiveness. Not only because the levelized cost of electricity from renewables are dropping, but also industry retail prices for electricity have proven to increase gradually. So not only from a climate or marketing perspective, it makes perfect sense to engage in green energy sourcing, but also from an economic perspective. In many cases, companies are able to reduce their energy costs, and also from a risk perspective, they can benefit when they lock in prices for many years. Okay, but that should be it for now about the motivation for corporate green energy sourcing. And let's go ahead and look at the different options to source energy from renewables. And these options can be differentiated according to location and ownership of the renewable energy asset. The solar power plant or wind farm can be owned and operated by the consumer himself, but it could also be leased from a utility or a project developer, or it could be fully owned by a third party, which the consumer could then have a direct relationship with or not. And the green attributes of power from renewable energy projects can simply be traded and retailed to a consumer. So the highest degree of ownership would be a self-owned renewable energy plant, and it would be most likely be located on site of the company's facilities. Naturally, this is not always feasible, and the potential is usually quite limited. So companies, of course, also source energy from off-site locations. So if we now put the three fundamentally different options on this graph, we see in green in the upper right corner that self-generation naturally has the highest degree of ownership and proximity. So that is really when a company decides to build solar or wind power on site. However, they do not necessarily have to also own it. They may choose to outsource the planning and operation, and with that, of course, the risk of a renewable energy asset to a third party. And if this supplier is then directly contracted by the consumer, we speak of renewable power purchase agreements. And these PPAs can actually range from assets which are actually on-site but not owned by the consumer to all the way to cross-border PPAs. So with PPAs, the consumer is buying renewable electricity directly from the generator and not from the utility. But there's also a way of course to source green power from a utility. Today, most of them include a green power product in their offering, and this type of product is based on the use of guarantees of origin. That is the name of renewable energy certificates in Europe, and how that works we will talk about in a second. But these are the three different general sourcing methods for green energy. In more detail, we have identified two different designs for each of the different sourcing instruments, just to shed some more light on how energy users are engaging in green energy and the energy transition. So looking at the first section, self-generation, we see that depending on regulatory frameworks, risk appetite and other factors, companies are installing solar panels or wind turbines on or near their company site with different approaches in terms of financing, ownership, and operation. We're not going into these details now because there are pretty much endless options to do this, but instead we want to speak about the actual energy flow and accounting, because some companies are actually building a microgrid to really directly use their own generated electricity. In that sense, at least for a period of time, they're operating an off-grid island and not feeding into the public grid or taking power from the public grid. That also means that in terms of congestion, they do not have a negative impact on the network, because as we all know, fluctuation, grid congestion, and network development are some of the main challenges of the energy transition. The downside is, of course, that the consumer needs to balance self-generation and self-consumption. So this requires system flexibility on a local or microgrid level, and this can be realized through the application of load management on the demand side, or flexible generation on the supply side, for example, with micro cogeneration units or energy storage. And this next slide visualizes this also. So today the flexibility that a conventional power system holds is sufficient, but also quite limited here on the vertical axis. And in a scenario with higher shares of fluctuating energy from renewable sources, the need for flexibility increases, while conventional power plants phase out and therefore provide only few flexible supply. And to close this gap, this flexibility gap, we will need flexibility on the demand side, on the distributed generation side, and from energy storage. So it really has to be probably a mix. So setting up a flexible microgrid would be the more ambitious and also more costly approach to source green energy from self-generation. The more common or traditional way, of course, is to connect the distributed generation to the grid. That way, generation and consumption are balanced by means of the public grid, meaning that the network or system operator takes care of that. But still, the use of the renewable energy is, of course, claimed by the company, and rightfully so. But one has to keep in mind that under some jurisdictions or circumstances, there may be a risk of double claiming. This could be the case if the generator receives subsidies, such as feed-in tariffs for the green electricity he is feeding into the grid. Then the actual sponsor may also claim the same electricity. One other thing to look out for is that in some countries or areas with high penetration of distributed generation and a high risk of grid congestion, it could be necessary to actually sort of apply for a specific capacity of distributed generation. But these factors are very much dependent on the respective regulatory framework where the renewable energy asset is supposed to be installed. Actually, less dependent on these external factors are the average lead times for renewable energy systems. Such projects usually can be categorized in these vertical phases on the left, from idea to development to consent to construction and then to operation. Operation in the end can be between 20 and 25 years. Lead times are typically around 1 year for solar energy and around maybe 5 years for wind energy, as more development and permits are necessary and also more time for construction. So if you decide today that self-generation is the preferred option for green energy sourcing for your company, note that you will not be able to go 100% renewable already tomorrow. But in the meantime, you may want to consider also other options. Power purchase agreements can be arranged with existing renewable generators, but also during project development. The terms and conditions of such agreements vary widely, also depending on the regulatory framework, and the different designs offer different pros and cons in terms of pricing and risks for the consumer. In some cases, large corporations also set up separate entities to directly source the energy from, sort of a mini utility in that sense. The many different designs of PPAs are very often categorized in physical or sleeve PPAs and synthetic or also called virtual PPAs. And a utility is always involved. In a physical PPA, the generator and consumer agree on a price, and the power is sort of sleeved by the utility, which basically means the utility delivers the power from the generator to the consumer and in return charges a sleeving fee. In a virtual PPA, the generator is actually selling the electricity as regular power to the utility at the market price on the power exchange. On the other end, the consumer continues to buy energy from the utility, also at the variable market price. But through the PPA, this price is now hedged for both sides, the consumer as well as the generator, and they agree a PPA price, and if the spot market price is higher than the PPA price, the generator needs to pay the spread to the consumer, and if the market price is lower, it is the other way around, of course. In addition to that, both parties, of course, agree that the consumer can claim the renewable energy attributes, and yeah, we're going to talk a bit more about this in the next section, but let's first come back to the PPAs from a more power flow and time series dimension, because also here, generator and consumer can engage in flexibility measures to at all times match supply and demand. This could be realized on the supply side through a virtual power plant consisting of various distributed energy resources. Such a balance between supply and demand would also strongly relieve the grid network. But usually, the integrated network's capability to balance supply and demand on a system level enables the consumer and generator to match supply and demand over a period of time, like on a weekly or monthly basis maybe. The balancing risk is then practically outsourced, usually to the grid operator. Okay, so coming back to how the renewable energy attributes are transferred to and claimed by the consumer. This is based on an energy tracking system. In Europe, that is the European Energy Certificate System, which is sort of subdivided into national systems. And in these systems, guarantees of origins are generated and traded and retired. One guarantee of origin represents 1 megawatt hour of green electricity, and this certificate can be used to turn 1 megawatt hour of gray electricity into green power. That is how also power from coal-fired power plants can be sold as green energy. And here's how it works. The green power generator feeds the electricity into the public grid, and from that moment on, it's just part of the overall energy flow, including electricity from all other power plants, renewable or fossil fuels or nuclear. They're all in the energy mix. The consumer, on the other hand, is delivered power from that grid and that mix. Now there's a tracking system for green power in place, governed by an issuing body. In that registry, a guarantee of origin certificate is created for each megawatt hour produced, and it is in the possession, or actually on the account of the generator. And now the utility comes in, it pays the generator a price for the certificate, and the guarantee of origin is transferred to the utility's account in the registry. Now the utility can sell electricity from basically any other source, or just really any source, to the consumer, and sort of add the guarantee of origin onto that and sell it as green power. And this is exactly the case with the first option here, bundled green power products. Consumers should be advised to pay good attention and request information about the origin of the renewable energy certificate to see how this fits their strategy and quality requirements. Now, the guarantees of origin can also be sourced separately and unbundled from the actual power purchase. In that case, the consumer continues buying power from the utility's energy mix, and then uses the certificates to sort of offset the gray energy consumption. This has the advantage, but also the challenge, to select specific renewable energy projects. There are traders and retailers who sell these unbundled guarantees of origin from various projects and retire them in the registry on behalf of the consumer. And here's an overview of how the certificates are used in Europe. On the left, you can see that 42% of guarantees of origin are created on behalf of renewable energy projects in Norway. That's mostly hydropower. with also Switzerland having a large share. On the other side, you see who actually uses the certificates to claim green energy. And it becomes clear that there are large exporters and large importers finding each other in this energy tracking system, with the Netherlands and France leading the demand for those guarantees of origin. Now, this overview looks at the origins of renewable energy certificates from a technology perspective. And you can see that hydro by far has the largest share. Now, you will notice that not only renewable sources are in this graph. That is because the tracking system is also used to some extent to track electricity attributes also from other sources, such as nuclear. But on the right side, you can see that this type of power origin is not demanded by the market. So after the cheap hydro, consumers also have quite some demand for power from wind and biomass energy. Now, very briefly, just note that the European system is, of course, not the only tracking system for energy from renewables. Across the globe, there are similar registries in place, and also in many developing and emerging regions, there are reliable systems in place which enable really multinational corporations to also source green energy wherever they have their production sites. And now that we've looked at these different options to source green energy, so what is actually common practice? And a survey among companies of the RE100 initiative shows that by far most of them go for the third option and use renewable energy certificates. As you can see here, 48% of the green energy consumption is based on an unbundled it's actually based on unbundled guarantees of origin to offset the consumption of gray electricity. And about the same quantity is sourced through bundled certificates in green power products. That leaves only 3% of green power sourced by means of direct power purchase agreements, and only 0.6% is actually self-generated. Self-generation splits about half-half into solar and wind energy, as you can see on the right. Okay, so we are about halfway through this webinar. We've looked at the different options for green energy sourcing, and now I would like to go over some criteria we developed to assess the credibility of these different options. And this approach right here is based on similar considerations brought forward by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the WWF, and also by high-quality green power labels like Eco Energy and Gold Power. So based on all that, we come up with these 6 credibility criteria, trying to describe high-quality green energy sourcing. And we understand credibility of a green energy sourcing option in this sense as an indicator for its quality and accountability, its contribution to the energy transition, and the buyer's level of ambition. Starting with the claiming instrument, a clear ownership structure, contractual connection, or robust green energy tracking system should be in place, which rule out any risk of double counting or double claiming of the same green megawatt hour. This means a system like those showed on the World Map should be in place. In the case of self-generation or PPAs, the case is of course pretty clear in terms of claiming the green energy. On to eligible technologies, because not everyone automatically has solar and wind in his or her mind, but it should be clear that we understand green energy as power from renewable sources, and that really excludes nuclear power and also high efficiency use of fossil resources. Those can of course be considered low carbon energy, but it does not qualify as renewable energy. And also for some renewable energy sources, specific requirements should apply. So when sourcing from geothermal, biomass, or hydropower projects, other ecological as well as social impacts of these projects have to be considered. That includes deforestation, relocation, or the competition with food production in the case of bioenergy, for example. Then additionality. So financial additionality should hold true and prove that revenues from the green power, a green energy purchase, enable the profitability of green energy projects. So yeah, also the green energy purchase should stimulate new projects. This is also sometimes referred to as investment additionality. That it means that, for example, in the case of eco-power, 10 cents per euro cents per megawatt hour have to be paid into a fund to help finance new renewable energy projects. Yeah, well, the bottom line of this really is that the consumer should be most credible, or he would be most credible if he made a significant contribution to the realization of the renewable energy project. Yeah, then again, in the case of self-generation, this is of course quite obvious. Same applies to market boundaries. Green energy should be sourced as locally as possible to take into account the physical flows and to relieve the grid capacities. Generation and consumption should take place preferably in the same province, country, bidding zone, or at least in the same energy tracking system. High proximity is naturally not always feasible. It's unlikely that every consumer is able to comply with this target in a cost-efficient system with high shares of renewables, also including offshore wind and large-scale hydropower. But still, also in the sense of the other criteria, high proximity is certainly in principle preferable. Also, younger projects are preferred. Green energy should be sourced from projects of young age, below their payback period. High quality energy power labels exclude actually facilities older than 14 years. And with this rule of thumb in terms of payback periods, which in some cases is certainly outdated, this requirement is also linked to additionality, really. Right, finally, vintage. So generated green electricity should be consumed or taken off instantly, while green energy sourcing is usually balanced on an annual or monthly basis. Real-time matching and flexibility provide a much higher contribution to the energy transition towards high shares of variable renewable energy sources. I think we already talked about this a bit. So what you don't want to do is to offset your 2017 consumption of gray electricity from the grid by means of 2016 Nordic hydro certificates, for example. So putting this then all together, we have here listed the 6 options here on the left, through per sourcing method. And we then made a qualitative and just indicative assessment of the options in terms of credibility. And you can see that in many cases the assessment really depends on the particular design of the green energy supply and also on the regulatory framework. However, one could argue, for example, that in terms of market boundaries, here in yellow, power purchase agreements are more likely to be arranged in the same country, whereas guarantees of origin are often sourced from other host countries. If you think back to the pie chart with high shares of hydropower from Norway. And same may apply to facility age and vintage. So I'd rather not spend too much time on this slide for now, because we will see this in a second on another graph. Instead, let's look at prices. So again, the different options are now on the bottom of the slide, and an imaginary vertical axis would indicate costs. Again, these are just indicative and refer to the consumer perspective. For self-generation, the renewable energy costs have to be considered, of course. They, of course, depend on location and other factors. But what we know is that the levelized cost of electricity from solar power, for example, have come down to around 5 cents per kilowatt hour. On top of that comes taxes and levies that may apply depending on the regulations. And if the consumer is connected to the grid, which is most likely the case, network tariffs will probably also be charged. If you are completely off-grid, all this may not apply, but instead substantial investments into flexibility measures to set up a reliable microgrid are necessary and can be quite costly. Next, let's look at the cost structures for PPAs. The underlying PPA price is also based on the levelized cost of electricity, maybe lower than for self-generation because we have seen those of large-scale wind power dropping down to about 3 cents. Then again, taxes and levies and network tariffs go on top of that. And also contractor premiums, including a sleeving fee for the utility, depending on the particular design of the PPA. And if real-time matching of supply and demand is pursued, then additional costs for that would incur. And they can be quite substantial as well. Then looking at guarantees of origin, we see prices on the energy trading platforms as low as 0.02 cents per kilowatt hour. This is the price for Nordic Hydro. For other origins and projects, higher prices are paid. And keep in mind that you are buying only the renewable energy attribute, only the greenest, so to say. So you still have to buy the actual power itself. And on top of that comes taxes, levies, and network tariffs. Now, if you choose a green power product from your utility, it could be the case that you are paying a slightly higher premium to the utility simply for handling the guarantees of origin. If you do that separately yourself or with the trader, you may be better off, but not necessarily, really. All right, so putting this all together here, we came up with this graph. And if you think back to the beginning of the webinar, when we looked at the different sourcing methods in terms of ownership and proximity, this picture is actually not that different, right? It makes sense. Ownership can be more cost-intensive, but not necessarily. And credibility seems to correlate with proximity, which also makes perfect sense. But it is worth noticing that self-generation with net metering and PPAs with outsourced balancing are actually competitive alternatives to green power products. And with practically negligible prices of guarantees of origin in mind, this means that self-generation and PPAs can also be the cost-effective alternative to regular gray electricity from the wholesale market. That's what we already noted at the beginning of the webinar when we talked about the motivation of green energy sourcing. So this graph also really confirms this, and we have made the experience that most also agree to this rough assessment here. I am, of course, well aware of the fact that the vertical axis is missing a scale and explicit prices, and this is simply because the range of prices and costs across different countries is extremely wide and also highly dependent on the specific case. Okay, so that should be it for the quality and price considerations. We have so far looked at how the different sourcing options work and how and now we have assessed them in terms of credibility and cost. So let's now move on from the current status quo to what we can expect to happen in the near future, as we know that developments are to a substantial extent policy-driven, and also the markets and technologies are moving fast. On the policy side, the European Commission is about to initiate some substantial changes in the regulatory framework in Europe. And end of last year, the Commission came forward with a clean energy package, which includes a recast version of the Renewable Energy Directive with guarantees of origin as one centerpiece of the proposed system, not only for electricity, but also for renewable gas in the future. So renewable energy, the renewable energy target on EU level for 2030 is defined at 27%. And while there are no sector-specific targets, experts expect that this target implies a share of renewable electricity of around 50%. And now if we look at the policy objectives behind that, so one objective is, of course, to simply reduce the cost of renewable energy. This can be achieved through research, development, and innovation programs that aim to reduce technology costs and operation maintenance costs, and also the cost of capital. And this is also related to reducing risk and increased planning reliability for developers. A second objective is to increase, on the other side, the market revenues for power from renewable sources. Revenues come from electricity sales and sales of guarantees of origin. In the case of self-generation, revenues would actually be your cost savings, really. But in terms of electricity sales for renewable energy project developers, the Commission is looking for ways to create new incentives, for example, for the provision of flexibility. And now what's annoying is that there's usually a gap between the costs and the revenues. And in order to still incentivize investments into renewable energy, the financing gap has to be closed through a support mechanism. And today there's actually a fundamental difference between EU member states when it comes to these subsidies, because some member states grant producers of renewable electricity both guarantees of origin and subsidies. So you would receive a feed-in tariff, for example, and a certificate that you can sell, whereas some member states grant producers of renewable electricity only guarantees of origin to sell on the market or subsidies to refinance the project, but not both. And now this latter case is proposed to become EU-wide regulation, and guarantees of origin from supported renewable electricity production are proposed to be issued and auctioned by member states. So they would not be handed to the generator because he already receives subsidies. And this is now something many stakeholders are not in favor of and criticize it a lot, mainly because of two things. It takes away some incentive to develop renewable energy projects, and it also makes it harder or maybe even impossible for consumers to select specific renewable energy projects, as the certificates would be auctioned. But we have to keep in mind that this would only apply to guarantees of origin and only to projects that receive additional financial support, so not to PPAs or self-generation. There are some other implications of the clean energy package proposals here on the slide, with most of them aiming to create a level field for all technologies and also to facilitate green energy sourcing. But in the interest of time, and I rather not spend too much time on this. And also this next slide only has some very high-level indications as to how the prices may develop in the future. The bottom line is some analysts expect rising prices on the electricity markets, while renewable energy technologies as well as flex technologies will become cheaper. So if you would like to learn more about the current trends in corporate renewable sourcing, I would advise you to sign up for this webinar from my colleague Malte next month. Malte is a highly recognized expert for energy policies and leading our service line in this area. You will not be able yet, I think, to actually find the webinar in the agenda to register, but just make sure to come back and check the agenda in just 1 or 2 weeks' time, maybe. So for today's webinar, I will conclude with some general recommendations to industrial consumers in regard to green energy sourcing. I believe foremost you should define a strategy and also consider defining specific targets. Joining one of the initiatives like science-based targets is an excellent way to develop a clear pathway towards a low-carbon or zero-carbon business. So when you have a particular goal defined that you want to achieve, this will be the first piece to the puzzle as it lays out the way forward and the impact green energy sourcing will have. Of course, the goal doesn't necessarily need to be 100% green. The goal could also be in line with EU targets or national targets well below 100%. The next piece would be the time frame. So do you want to go 100% green tomorrow, or do you have time to assess opportunities for self-generation and to arrange renewable power purchase agreements? And then the next question is, of course, how much money are you willing to spend, and in which way? Are you willing to make a substantial investment upfront, or would you rather choose a third-party ownership structure? And what type of requirements does your finance department demand in terms of payback periods and so on? And finally, where do you want to source green energy from? Are you fine with Nordic hydro guarantees of origin, or would you strive for more credibility and more proximity Do your sites actually allow for on-site generation? So these are just some basic questions you would need to answer to start with. If you have done that and you have decided to go for green energy sourcing, there are some basic steps to follow. The first phase would be to analyze your energy consumption and your future demand for energy. Then you may also want to check your potential for flexibility in terms of load management, for example, and then see what potential for on-site or near-site self-generation there might be. Then really define the corporate energy strategy in line with the overall objectives and constraints we just talked about. And there's several options for green energy supply can be considered. Those should be assessed in terms of potential costs and risks and benefits. And if you have decided which option is the one you want to follow, you would probably draft a request for a proposal for green energy supply under defined conditions, just like most large consumers put their energy demand or such projects out for tender. In order to receive a good number of proposals, you may want to market the request properly and then evaluate the long list of bids from green energy suppliers. Based on your evaluation criteria, you should then shortlist the most attractive bids and perform a thorough legal, financial, and technical assessment of the suppliers, and finally select the best offer. And now, also to take into account that there may be more than one option or sourcing method for green energy of interest for you. These last steps, you can of course repeat for several projects. You can tender a solar power plant for self-generation, you can tender power purchase agreements, and also guarantees of origin or green power products. And as I already mentioned, companies usually apply various criteria to evaluate bids from potential suppliers, both cost and non-cost related. And here are just some examples how that could look like. So from the monetary perspective, it would make sense to check the assumptions which the supplier made to assess the offer price. And on the more qualitative side, you would run a thorough check of the supplier in terms of experience and risks. Okay, so final conclusion. A range of green energy sourcing options exist that can fit into an overall sustainability strategy for industrial consumers. Green energy sourcing is becoming more attractive to industrial consumers as carbon reduction strategies are implemented and so on. Options for green energy sourcing range from self-generation to PPAs and guarantees of origin. And they differ in technologies and locations of the green energy projects, ownership, and also differ in risk structures as well as prices. And various initiatives have developed quality requirements and recommendations for green energy sourcing. In conclusion, the credibility of green energy sourcing depends on the selected option and the design of the supply. But high quality green power products sourcing from new local renewable energy projects and power purchase agreements are perceived quite credible. On-site and near-site self-generation shows the highest credibility ranking though. And guarantees of origin from conventional renewable energy assets like northern hydro are perceived as least credible. Implementation of flexibility technologies enhances contribution to the energy transition and also improves credibility of green energy sourcing. And in terms of policy and market trends, I again strongly recommend joining the next webinar on this topic on October 26th. That was it. So back here you may find ways to connect with us, and I also have my contact details here on the last slide. But I think if you need us, you will find an easy way to get in touch with us. So I want to right now already thank you very much for your patience and attention. Fernando, I would say then back to you, and let's see what questions we have.